My name is Ahmed Malik, orthopedic consultant. I've treated lots of famous people, never been starstruck, quite proud of that, but almost starstruck right now. You're clearly very generous people. You spent 2 years working hard, defending rights, and I'm really grateful to both of you and Alan. But I think you are being too generous. I think saying this is all accidental and incompetence, I find that difficult. It's too convenient. You know, all the politicians marching, lock, stock, same way, speaking the same language. It was all too much. The pandemic, the 202, meeting 202, the fact that the virus has already been patented, part of it. The design of this whole thing was more than just a coincidence. And I think we're just skirting around this. And Bill Gates and his influence, one of the biggest funders, if not the biggest funder of the WHO, I think he had a big role of changing the definition of the vaccine. The people who had the money to make the vaccine, who infiltrated all our politicians and cabinets, widely mentioned proudly by a very famous Klaus Schwab. I mean, I'm sorry, it's too much. And I think it's important because you said if we don't know about history, it will repeat itself. I think we need to look at the fact that a lot of our politicians, our media, our public health sector workers have been captured. And they're all working together. They're all funded by the same finance moguls, billionaires, oligarchs, media, healthcare, pharma, politicians, and they're screwing us over. And if we don't know that, it's going to carry on, and it still is, whether it's statins or childhood vaccines, or when you walk into a food shop and all of it is just shit. And now that you've told me about Bill Gates, I understand why he looks like he does. He's clearly eating the product he is invested in. But the fact is, you're being too generous. I really do. And I think we need to understand the nefarious element of what's happened in the last 2 years. Because like Bill Gates has said, you know, if you're not scared of this pandemic, you better be for the next one. And what does he know? Because that's what I'm worried about.
Thank you.
So,
We're very lucky this evening because we've got two fantastic speakers and I'm very excited about it. I want to get into it very quickly. And just to say the format for the evening is that I'm going to briefly introduce them and then they're going to do some introductory reflections on the topic. The theme of the night is the COVID era, what was learned and which way forward. And then we're going to come out to the audience and you guys can ask some questions. We'll take some rounds and Francis will be here with a mic. You can come up on the side and we'll do that. If anyone does not want to be filmed, you should know it's going out live stream. So don't come and speak if you don't want to be filmed, just so you know. And then we'd also always encourage everyone to become members, anyone who's not, because that's a really good way that we can carry on doing the things we're doing. So straight into it. Well, welcome tonight, everyone, to the Together Talks. When the Great Barrington Declaration was written and published in 2020 in October, it appealed to many across the world, medical professionals as well as citizens, with its approach to shielding the vulnerable and continuing with previous pandemic approaches. Although some challenged it, many in fact, including the American Public Health Association and the World Health Organization, and we can go into discussing this and the reasons behind that in the debate tonight. But we're really lucky to have Dr. Jay Bhattacharya with us this evening. He's the co-founder, well, everyone knows. Absolutely. Well, everyone knows who you are, but I'll carry on saying who you are, but everyone knows who you are. He's the co-founder of the Great Barrington Declaration, which was him along with colleagues with Sunetra Gupta from Oxford and Martin Kuljoff from Harvard. And Jay's a professor of health policy at Stanford University and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economics Research. And he directs Stanford's Center for Demography and Economics of Health and Aging. He focuses on the health and well-being of vulnerable populations with a particular emphasis on the role of government programs, biomedical innovation and economics. And Jay's recent research focuses on the epidemiology of COVID-19, as well as an evaluation of policy responses to the epidemic. So I've asked Jay this evening to do some introductory reflections on the title, but I also, of course, want to introduce Dr. Aseem Malhotra, who is also very well known, and we're very lucky to have him with us. This evening, and I'll call him Aseem if that's okay with everyone, but we know his title. He's an NHS trained consultant cardiologist and visiting professor of evidence-based medicine at the Bhattacharya School of Medicine and Public Health in Salvador, Brazil. He's a world-renowned expert in the prevention, diagnosis and management of heart disease. Aseem has appeared regularly, as many of you will have known and seen, in the press for many years, having written widely on health, nutrition and heart disease, and more recently, of course, on the context of COVID and responses. And Aseem was shortlisted by the Sunday Times list as one of the world's most influential individuals in the UK in the fields of science and medicine. He's president of the Public Health Collaboration, and we're really pleased to have him here with us tonight. So, I'm going to get straight into it. I'm going to ask you, Jay, for some reflections on the title, and then we'll come over to you, Aseem, and then I'm going to ask some questions to you. So, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for that. And thank you for such a kind response. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, Alan asked me to talk a little bit about the Great Barrington Declaration, how it came about, and what it meant to me, and what the response was to it from the public health community. So first, I should say that while I'm very proud of the Great Barrington Declaration, I think it's written with some style. There's not one original idea in it. It is the old pandemic plan, and it's what it is the idea that if you have a threat like COVID, a respiratory disease, a new disease, what do? You identify who's most at risk, move heaven and earth to protect them, and then disrupt society as little as possible, because the harm from disrupting society hurts the people that aren't vulnerable. That's the old pandemic plan. It's a pandemic plan that we followed for respiratory pandemics for a century. And it works. It's not splashy. It doesn't lead to 0 deaths, because that's not possible with a disease like COVID. What it does do is that it thinks about society and the health of people holistically, because COVID is not our only threat to our health. There are many, many other threats, both mental health and physical health. So the idea of the Great Barrington Declaration is as old as the hills. Who's vulnerable to COVID? You all know it's older people. There's a 1,000-fold difference in the risk of bad outcomes. For the oldest versus the youngest. 40% of the deaths worldwide have been in nursing homes and care homes. 80% of the deaths have been people over the age of 65. For children, it poses less of a risk than many other risks that they face in their life. The biggest risk to children have been disruptions in their normal life. School closures, inability to make friends. We've harmed our kids in so many ways. And so the Great Barrington Declaration, it's just common sense, right? I assume that's why you're all here. It's just common sense. The moral thing to do is to protect the elderly from this threat the best we can. The moral thing to do is to not harm our kids, and for the rest, go about living our lives as best we can, given that there is this threat, given we know that there are some folks that do face harm if they're infected. The response to this, I would say that it normally would have shocked me, but in the months leading up to the Great Barrington Declaration, I realized, to my utter shock, how dysfunctional our public health system really was. We had latched on to this idea of lockdown as a way to protect everybody, with the implicit promise that, well, if we lock down, if we suppress ourselves, including the lives of young people, we can somehow get the disease to go away. A vaccine will come, the disease will go away. Maybe a new drug will be developed, the disease will go away. Until then, society should no longer function. That idea was adopted by the very highest people in public health. right? The people like Tony Fauci in the United States, in the World Health Organization, although they claimed not to adopt it, actually did de facto adopt it. And they pushed back hard. We wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. One of the key ideas in it is that eventually there'll be enough people in the population with immunity to the disease that the disease will no longer pose as steep a threat as it once did, which is actually what's come true, right? World Health Organization rewrote the definition of herd immunity to say it could only be achieved by a vaccine, not by the fact of population immunity generally. The head of the National Institute of Health in the United States, a man named Francis Collins, very famous man who was responsible for the Human Genome Project, wrote an email 4 days after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration to Tony Fauci. Everyone know Tony Fauci? Who's ever heard of him? The email called me, Martin Kulldorff, and Sunetra Gupta fringe epidemiologists. My friends have given me a business card. Let's see if I brought it with me. That says fringe epidemiology on it. I mean, if the Great Barrington Declaration is the fringe, I don't really want to be at the center, I think. The response was fierce, and it was a propaganda campaign. And the question is why? Why was there this propaganda campaign to suppress common sense? It's very simple. Because we had already adopted lockdown, right, as the strategy. A lot of people, a lot of powerful people were dead wrong about the right response. And they needed in order, and remember October 2020, there was an active debate in the UK and elsewhere whether we were going to need another lockdown in the winter of 2020. People at the World Health Organization, the National Institute of Health in the United States, they wanted to create an illusion that all scientists agreed in favor of lockdown. It's an illusion a false illusion of consensus that did not actually exist. And so the Great Barrington Declaration, not because I wrote it with Sunetra and Martin, that wasn't the real thing. The real thing was tens of thousands of doctors, tens of thousands of scientists, and almost 1 million regular people signed on. And it shattered the illusion that there was a consensus in favor of lockdown. That's why there was this fierce attack on common sense. Hopefully, Alan, we'll get to talk about this. Is, I think, the main theme of this. The question to me is, how do we make sure that this never happens again? Because this isn't the last respiratory pandemic that we're going to face. And the powers, and Aseem has been fantastic on this, the powers that worked to create the lockdown, to create the pathologies in public health that we had, will come back again if we don't work together to fix it.
Thank you. Aseem, over to you. Thank you.
Wow, where do I start? Thank you, Jay, and thank you for all your inspiring work. I've learned a lot from you, and I think just leading on from, I think one of the first bits of research I read of yours was around the gradient of risk, the 1,000-fold gradient of risk between people who are very young and people who are older. So what I would start by saying, and part of my background as an obesity activist, is that we had a fast pandemic that exploited a slow pandemic of chronic disease. We know, for example, once you exclude the elderly, the people who are most vulnerable to serious illness from COVID were people with conditions related to excess body fat. Just to give you some sort of raw numbers, so UK Biobank study at the beginning of the pandemic, the ancestral variant, which was obviously much more severe than what's going on now, the one that's circulating now, revealed that if you suffered from weight-related problems, if you were extremely overweight or obese, and a smoker and sedentary, then your risk of hospitalization was about 1 in 327. But if you had optimal metabolic health, then you had a 4 to 5-fold decreased risk of being hospitalized, 1 in 1,500. So these are sort of important figures to understand in terms of who was vulnerable. I think what was really extraordinary, though, despite the fact that this was something that was highlighted very early on in the pandemic, is our public health authorities failed miserably to do anything to actually help combat this problem. You know, I know from my own research and research that's available that you can actually improve these conditions that are linked to immune resilience very, very quickly within weeks of just pure dietary changes. Yet, in the middle of the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, we had one NHS hospital trust actually proudly sharing that they had were getting 1,000 free Krispy Kreme donuts delivered to their NHS staff. So what does it all of this for me is a symptom of, you know, of the corporate capture of medicine and public health. And this is something that has been going on for a very, very long time. We've not tackled this issue, whether it's to do with the food industry or to do with the drug industry. You know, I have attempted on several occasions, at least 3, I would say through mainstream media with powerful backers, to call for an inquiry into the practices of the drug industry that produce research that is commercially corrupted, they hide the data, and then doctors are making clinical decisions on information which is biased. And of course, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that when you're making clinical decisions on biased and corrupted information, you're going to get bad outcomes for your patients. And we have had in the UK, certainly, and I'm sure the data is similar in the US, we've had a stalling in life expectancy since 2010. In the last few years, we've seen certain parts of the country where people's healthy life expectancy is reducing. And again, the COVID pandemic had exacerbated all these problems because we'd not tackled the root cause of all these health problems. And I think moving forward, one, to deal with another respiratory pandemic, God forbid we don't have one anytime soon, but it could happen again, you know, certainly in the next few decades, is that we address public health properly. And I think people also need to fully acknowledge that the roots of the problem, the causes of the causes behind a lot of the misinformation that's out there around the pandemic, around understanding people's risk, around, dare I say it, the benefits and potential harms of a emergency use authorization vaccine, is rooted in unchecked power of very big, powerful corporations whose only motive is to make profit. And in the pursuit of their profit, they suppress free speech, they suppress information, and they are damaging. Their overall net effect is negative on society, and they are, in my view, when I talk about 2 of those big industries, the food industry and the pharmaceutical industries, enemies of democracy. Okay? So we have to reframe the thinking and the narrative on who is actually responsible for most of these societal problems. And if we concentrate on the root cause, then we will actually have much better outcomes as we move forward in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Aseem. So I want to drill down on a few things, though, because there's lots of questions. And rather than just assuming everyone agrees or even that everyone knows, but let's ask a few basic questions. I mean, at the start in the UK, we know that there were some outliers like Sweden and then later on Florida and a few states in the States. But in the UK, initially, the government went in a certain direction and they did a kind of U-turn. There were some reasons for that. Partly it was because there was a very shrill kind of response from certain demographics and some other reasons. But my question is, the word unprecedented was used a lot, right? But lockdowns really were unprecedented. I think maybe once in Mexico, they'd done it for 10 days. It was like never been done before. And then there's a Chinese model. Why did, in your opinion, having studied public health, being an expert on it, and why did that happen in such a uniform way? Because many people have lots of ideas about that. But what, from your point of view, what actually happened?
I think if you look at the
Sorry, just use one and pass it. Sorry.
I mean, if there was a set of emails actually that was released via a Freedom of Information Act request in the very early stages of the pandemic. The World Health Organization had a mission to China. China in January of 2020 locked down. You remember January 2020? It was the disease looked like it was going to spread throughout China, but then all of a sudden it disappeared in China. Late January, early February 2020, you look in Italy. Do you remember the images out of Italy? The images out of Italy were absolutely horrific. There were coffins lined up, a huge number of older people dying, lined up, and people panicked. At the same time, out in the UK, there was this Imperial College model that forecasted, that said it was a model that said that there would be 500,000 deaths here and 2 million deaths in the United States if we didn't lock down. If we locked down, the disease would flatline. So the World Health Organization, the UK government, the American government, all of them came to the conclusion that the Chinese model would work. And I think that played an enormously important role in explaining why public health changed its mind on a dime from these old plans. They looked at the Chinese model, they looked at Italy, said, we can't have what happened in Italy. The NHS is going to get overrun. The American healthcare system is going to get overrun. But if we do what China did, we suppress free speech, we close schools, we end your livelihoods. If we stay at home, we can stay safe. And that's what we did. We went down that path.
Yes.
Can I just add to that? So I was speaking to Jay about this on the drive here, and my understanding is that the original response, the prepared response for pandemics such as this, was never a lockdown. And it changed because of China, because we were led to believe that the lockdown, that Wuhan, in Wuhan, contained the virus. Now, I learn a lot from speaking to people in various places. And I know a lot of journalists. And one person who is a broadcast journalist for Chinese TV, who I interacted with, I asked this person many, many months ago, I said, did Wuhan contain the virus? He said, no, Aseem, it spread throughout the whole of China. So we were misled from that perspective. And then to add on to that, recently, and I'm just going to share a message from her. And I tweeted about this, but you may not have heard this one. So a few months ago, in fact, not a few months ago, not that long ago, we saw images again from China, a military-style operation going on, which is pretty horrific to watch what they were doing with the Omicron variant, which we know is considerably milder compared to the other variants. And I just messaged her and I said, what's going on here? Why is China in lockdown again? Is it Omicron? Her response was this: yes, Aseem, mass Chinese population still see COVID as Ebola. Touch it and you die. And China, despite the world's second largest economy, has very poor doctor to patient ratio and very tight medical resources. They can't afford a pandemic spreading. But increasingly, they now realize Omicron is not as deadly as Delta. Government opinion is slowly changing. I hope they will open up again soon. So I think what this highlights again is a level of, I think, fear-based policy and health and statistical illiteracy as well. Because we're emotional beings, and all of us at the very beginning, including myself, I remember at the very beginning of the pandemic, when we weren't sure what was going on, but we were seeing these images, horrific images from Italy. You know, I was bringing, going to the supermarket, and I was spraying Dettol on all of the packets of stuff I was buying before I even opened it. I mean, just think about, this is the effect it has on people that are supposed to be very rational and even scientists. So I think we have to obviously throw that into the equation too.
Well, I think that's really important, that point, because when things were unclear and there was the use of fear within the whole thing. And when I say use, I want to sort of separate these things, because it's certainly the case in the last 15 years or so, 20 years, that fear, anxiety, the relationship to risk has been reconfigured in the world, in Western society in particular. The idea that we're vulnerable, we're at risk to things, rather than the idea of the dynamic, history creating agents that maybe at one point, public might have seen themselves as, and certain political outlooks might have had that view that, people really are strong and dynamic. A lot of the whole rhetoric prior to COVID and everything is that that we're all at risk of things, and equally a problem. And often policies in the past, in the run-up, way before COVID, I think, but you might think I'm wrong, have been about, when in doubt, regulate and clamp down, not really have transformative ideas. And I wonder, because I want to drill it down a bit more, because there's a lot of people that will be watching this that think this is just all being planned. It's a very particular plan that's just laid out, and maybe many in the audience think this as well. And then others will think, well, actually, they said, is it cock up or conspiracy? But others will think, well, actually, there's been a journey. Like we've had the behavioural insights team, the nudge units for the last decade and a half. We've had a treatment of contempt of the public and a reactive policy, and this kind of went on steroids. I mean, from what you've seen, what's your take on it? I think we can use all the mics now. I think that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe there was a plan. I think that there was a confluence of interests, each of which contributed in its own way. So let's just take, for instance, Alan, something you mentioned, this nudge unit. Everyone know about the nudge unit, right? So the nudge unit is a subgroup inside SAGE. SAGE is the body that's scientific advisors to the UK government. They are behavioral economists and psychologists. And over the last 15, 20 some years, there's been a big movements in behavioral economics and in psychology. Nobel Prizes have been awarded in understanding how people respond to incentives. There's the flip side of that. If you understand a little bit more about how incentives work and how people respond to incentives, well, maybe we can use incentives to get people to do the right thing. It's a pandemic. We want to have a lockdown. I mean, there's going to be people that are going to resist a lockdown. Well, why don't we use these new techniques we've developed to try to get people to do the right thing? It's moral to do that because we're preventing deaths, right? That's what the people tell themselves. Even though it's deeply unethical to use these kinds of techniques to manipulate people, that's the story that people told themselves. It's the middle of a pandemic, right? You can do these things in the middle of a pandemic. I think a lot of the things that, Alan, that you mentioned are things along those lines. They're like changes in different fields that come together to create what we saw. It wasn't one field, one Uber leader that had all of the plan in place. It was each group acting in its own interests that created this, a vaccine. Maybe we could have it in a year instead of a normal 10-year development, right? We're just on the edge of this new technology. We can try this, right? We have a development of these drugs that are on the shelf that we can rush to approval. All of these things each group has its own self-interests inside policymaking that led to this. I don't believe there's one group that controlled all of it.
Okay, and I think it's something we can all keep discussing, but I think it's really important in terms of how anything's addressed in the future and the insistence of certain things like previous pandemic strategies and the Great Barrington Declaration, what shielding can mean and everything, which we'll come back to. But you mentioned what you called the corporate capture of medicine, but there is also the question, is there not, of the public sector in Britain and how actually it looked like some elements of the public sector, certainly teachers, put a lot of pressure on the government, and others that had a particular view about not putting themselves at risk. While some workers were out all the time right through the pandemic, others were very vocal about not doing that. And I wonder to what extent you might think there were a number of things playing at that, and also the role that, to what extent the Prime Minister not outsourced or not too much responsibility to medical and science, being someone who's from medicine yourself, if he came along and said, right, Aseem, you tell me now, you come and be there. What do you think that relationship should be between policymakers, elected representatives and, professional scientists? Where do you stand on that?
A couple of things. First of all, just to reaffirm what Jay said, I also generally think there was a mistake. And then what's happened is these vested interests have exacerbated or capitalized on the mistakes that were made at the beginning. And then we've ended up with a huge mess. In terms of the issue around different professions and the role that they played in perpetuating the lockdown narrative, again, I think one thing that's very interesting for people to... So first of all, fear is very, very damaging for mental health and physical health. And that wasn't taken into consideration in their plan, because you scare the hell out of somebody in this sort of situation, and it can be very debilitating. And what wasn't made clear, which Jay's work and John Ioannidis' work did when they did their Santa Clara study on the risk, is actually people understanding their individual risk from this virus, because it would have changed things a lot. So one survey in the States, and I can't cite it, it was something I heard in an interview, was, and this is quite extraordinary, but maybe not surprising, is that in this survey of American voters, half of them thought their risk of dying from COVID was 50% if they got it. In other words, 1 in 2 would die. Now, there are many people going around with that very heightened belief. And if you start from that perspective and understanding that their risk is actually, that's what they think, of course, that's going to drive some of these behaviors. I think that's also a big area. This is a massive problem. Basic numeracy, and not rocket science stuff, just, public health authorities explaining in a more transparent way risk and benefit of treatments, but also from COVID. I think that was missing from the discussion. In relation to the what relationship should we have between government and scientists, I think the public still want to get independent, transparent, honest policy-making decisions. And we would trust our governments more if those decisions were made in those ways, but they're not being made in those ways. And one of the things that's very interesting is, I mentioned earlier that we're seeing a decline in the health of our populations around the world. 2 things to say there. One is, actually, when society health fails, that's actually taking us towards a failed state. Because 2 primary purposes of government are protect the population from external aggressors and to protect the population from disease. And if they're failing to do that, there is something almost subconsciously where you also get less trust in government. So what I'm saying, Alan, is if people trusted the governments to be doing things that were in their interest, then I think that is a role that I think that we all want. We want our policies actually to be something that gives all of us the best opportunity to lead healthy, happy lives. And we know that's not happening. And therefore, then you have loss of trust and you have all of this division that's created.
Well, one of the things that is really noticeable is that people talk a lot. There's a lot of words that are used, but actually you can have a very weak government, a very weak set of elected representatives that can be very authoritarian at the same time. It's actually their weakness that can end up doing that. And perhaps I think a combination of outsourcing to SAGE and also civil servants having a real influence. And in the UK, we saw some of that kind of, and there was a kind of abdication of responsibility. Like they're the smart ones about this. And if you give it to people that are only going to think about one thing, maybe, then you're going to get, because as you've said from the get-go and all along, is that there's a range of different risks and costs to be addressed. And you're talking about mental health and education and children and families. And now we're dealing with the cost of living crisis, right? So from the point of view of what's being understood and learned, we're meant to have a COVID inquiry here. It won't be till 2025 or 26. In Canada, they've got one going on at the moment. They've got a commission, which is really interesting considering everything that's happened there. But lots of things are coming out, like ministers are saying that the police demanded an emergency response, and it wasn't that at all. And that's becoming, so things are coming out. But I'm wondering, this is a long way of getting to say, to what extent do you think that making it clear now, how much of the lessons been learned by anyone? How much is there an admission of things from your point of view, from both your points of view? And how much work have we got to do to make it really, really abundantly clear about the costs of some of these things and the consequences?
I think so. The path forward we need an absolutely honest evaluation of what happened, an absolutely honest one, and I think that currently we are not in a position to have that. A lot of the people that made these decisions, they would love this just to be behind us. And now my philosophy about this is that I mean, I agree entirely with Aseem. This was huge mistakes were made, and then a lot of interest like piled on. There were the set of people that made these mistakes is huge. It's not, and I don't believe most of them had malign interest. They were just doing what they do. So what's the right way to deal with this? Is in medicine there's an idea called a morbidity and mortality conference. I don't know if you've heard of this, an M&M conference. The idea is that a patient dies and somebody on the medical team made a mistake. We don't know who. You get together as a medical staff and you discuss what happened to the patient. You don't point fingers. You just discuss what mistakes were made. Notice the passive voice. And commit to not making those mistakes again. I think that's the sense in which we're going to need to address this, because otherwise the people that made the mistakes will clamp up, and they're enormously powerful. And we will never learn, and we will never, and they'll win.
Well, on this point, just to explore it a bit more, you've done a lot of work on, obviously, on the question of obesity, healthy eating, heart disease, the correlation. It was striking to me, and this is true both in the States and here, that actually prior to COVID, a lot of people had begun to talk about obesity, exercise, all the different things, right? Food. But it was almost like it was not discussed at all as one of the contributing factors. Now, why do you think that is?
I think because, well, it's multifactorial. Again, it comes back, Alan, to these vested interests that have too much control on the narrative. So the food industry will talk about individual responsibility and not about the fact that they, are marketing and targeting children with unhealthy products. And probably the data is emerging that a lot of the foods that they sell to people and target are probably addictive as well. So there's all of that thrown in there. I think that one other person I'm going to mention, who I think also had a lot of, how should I put it? I think too much influence on the narrative, is Bill Gates. Now, I discovered recently that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is heavily invested in McDonald's and Coca-Cola and stocks in McDonald's and Coca-Cola. He doesn't talk about non-communicable diseases in terms of his plan, and he has a lot of influence on a lot of these governments and organizations. So the narrative is not a full, transparent, honest one when it comes to how do we improve population health. And I think that's one of the reasons it wasn't tackled. And in fact, made worse. I think, in fact, we've got data, Jay was saying in the US, people have gained more weight during the pandemic. We've got similar data in the UK, when it should have been going the other way, when we knew those risks were very, very clear. I publicly, I think, was the person to suggest on Good Morning Britain, when I'd written an article in the Telegraph that made the front page saying, the elephant in the room is that obesity is being one of the biggest risk factors, had mentioned that Boris likely got unwell because of his weight. And then that triggered a story, which led to Matt Hancock contacting me and asking me about what do we need to do to tackle obesity. And I said, you need to do exactly what we did with tobacco. These ultra-processed foods that are more than half of the calories of the British diet are actually, if they're treated like tobacco are, in terms of, making healthy foods more affordable, these policy changes will have a big impact. And he took it on board, but nothing happened. So the information is there, the evidence is there, but what I would say is the evidence alone is not enough. Opposition from powerful vested interests needs to be overcome.
So in the States, we see a very interesting, almost like a dichotomy, right? A distinction between different areas doing different things at the same time, which is great at one level, right? Because you get to do some comps, and comps are always difficult because of demographics and everything. But it's interesting. In New York, for instance, you've got a situation where they're still getting people to wear masks on the subway. If you're going to museums, inside spaces, Broadway, there's no real demonstration of the efficacy of it, but it's almost like a continuation of it. We've seen in Germany and Ireland now people saying maybe you should have masks. In fact, the NHS Confederation here was suggesting that people should wear masks. In the context of learning lessons about something like this and the impacts of lockdowns that we're dealing with now, like the cost of living, and how would you say, have you got any thoughts in terms of policy and making that happen faster when you've got responses like that happening already now? And have you got any ideas about how that could be done?
I mean, there's already a lot of scientific interest, Alan, on exactly that question. And there was a major study done out of Johns Hopkins University it was a study of studies, a whole bunch of studies, looking at the effects of lockdowns. Now, of course, you can't randomize a lockdown, so there are limitations to each of the studies. But the conclusion of these studies of studies is that lockdown had at most 2-3% effect on deaths, reductions in COVID deaths. Just mind you, just on COVID, not any of the other effects on other causes of death that will have a long tail, right? So if you look at, I'll just give you a simple example out of Florida. Florida is a place where I've had a little bit of influence on the policy. Followed a much more focused protection-like policy. Not perfect. No, there's no place that did it perfectly. Versus California, where I live. California has a younger population, so you'd expect there to be a lower per capita death rate, and it has a lower per capita death rate. But once you adjust for the fact that Florida has an older population, the COVID death rate's almost identical. And children in Florida were in school the entire pandemic. Children in California spent almost 2 years with disruptions in their schooling. New York, 2-year-olds were masked. Toddlers were masked on the basis of no evidence. Enormous changes in the lives of people in the lockdown states with almost nothing to show for it in terms of protection against COVID. Sweden has a lower age-adjusted mortality from COVID than the UK. The evidence that lockdowns did any good whatsoever is small. The evidence that lockdowns harmed the population in terms of many things other than COVID is enormous and indisputable. I think no one listening to this can honestly say that their lives were improved by lockdowns.
Can I ask you a question? I've been listening to what you were saying, and it strikes me as a little confusing because take an example like New York. You had a very stringent policy on certain things like food and sugary drinks, and you've had sugary drink taxes here, and you've had government doing all sorts of interventions. And in fact, in New York, I realized something some time ago is when they banned smoking in public parks. There's no epidemiological proof anywhere to say that secondhand smoking in the park outside does anything beyond it. But it was still done, right? It was so you've got this thing where there was a public health policy. It was very much about intervening actually in decisions about food and tobacco, and yet they've been one of the most stringent. So it's almost like it seemed to me that there was a correlation, right, between intervening around things like food and smoking and all that and COVID versus other states that might have had a more kind of you choose what you do thing. But just how do you see that relationship?
I think, Alan, the point you're trying to make is that they used the concepts of public health intervention in the response to the pandemic, but didn't do it for stuff around food. Is that what you're alluding to?
Well, I'm almost sort of challenging the idea that, I think that some states and authorities have become very intervening around food and drink and choices. And they're often the ones that were quite restrictive around COVID policy. So I wonder how you...
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think the one thing I would say in terms of... There's not really been any... I mean, we got a sugary drinks tax in the UK a few years ago. They've got that in Mexico. It will probably take a little bit more time, but obviously it's confounded by all of the pandemic and all the other stuff that people are eating. We haven't really had any effective policies that I believe, certainly to tackle obesity, introduced anywhere. And if we do that, we will. The evidence tells us it's very likely you'll see massive reductions in health improvements in health outcomes in the population very quickly. So I don't think we've seen that anywhere. Yeah.
I mean, like in New York, for instance, they tried to do a soda tax, right? So maybe there is some correlation. On the other hand, I would have predicted Sweden would have been very aggressive with the public health programs. I would not. I wouldn't have. I would have. It's not like a right-left thing, right? So you have a right-wing government in the UK adopting a very strict lockdown. You have Florida is governed by a right-wing Republican who just opted against a lockdown. You have a left-wing governor in New York, in Andrew Cuomo, who went with a very steep lockdown. The lockdown, no lockdown kind of decision cuts against the grain. It splits both parties in half in a very odd way.
Well, we're going to come out to the audience in a minute because I know people are going to ask questions and say things, but along with lockdowns and policies, we were also told that it was going to be 15 million jabs to freedom in Britain. We saw the discussion about what it would mean internationally. And then that kept going on. And then it was, 60-year-olds, 50 or 40. And then we got to children. And then we got to, and people, you're sort of thinking, well, you're going to, and then you got to 5 to 11-year-olds. And now in the States, you've got 6-month-olds. I mean, whilst people now recognize, I think generally, but tell me if you think I'm wrong, that it doesn't stop you from catching it. It doesn't stop you from spreading it, and that you can keep having it with it. And yet, and then why is this drive? What's happening? Why is there a drive to push this with children at 6 months old? And what do you think is going on there?
I'm deeply puzzled by it, honestly. I think the vaccine, the trial itself, the vaccine trials, they had as an endpoint, they had prevention of symptomatic infection, which sounds like a sensible thing, but actually is not epidemiologically not so important. You could have had the trial to check to see if it prevented deaths. The trial wasn't powered for that. The trials could have been powered to check for prevention of infection, right? So if you have a vaccine that prevents infection, then you can use it to stop the disease from spreading, right? My vaccine protects you, right? That's what most traditional vaccines are like. If you have a vaccine that prevents against severe disease and death, you can use it for focused protection. Use it on the 15 million jabs and you're done, as long as it's on the right 15 million people. We have a trial that doesn't tell us if it does one or the other. Only prevention of symptomatic infections for 2 or 3, 4 months. The public health authorities made a guess that it would stop disease spreading. So not just 15 million, you now need to inoculate almost the entire population. When we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, October of 2020, the World Health Organization changed its definition of herd immunity to say that it could only be accomplished by vaccination. They guessed that the vaccine would stop disease spread. It doesn't stop disease spread. I believe, and maybe it's controversial in the room, I believe it could be used for focused protection. But I don't believe it can be used for stopping disease spread. And they've doubled down on that over and over and over again. And that's why you're seeing it even in kids.
We've got to ask, why do you think, just from your opinion, the World Health Organization changed that definition? What happened?
The World Health Organization, when it changed that definition, it was going against a century of like a basic epidemiological fact. When a sufficient fraction of the population has immunity to a disease, the population as a whole is protected against. That's the idea of herd immunity, right? I think what they were worried about was lack of compliance with lockdown, right? If the idea is that I get the disease and now I'm protected against the disease, the second time I get it is going to be less severe, I'm going to comply less with lockdowns, aren't I? That's why this denial of natural immunity, this basic fact that shows up in study after study after study, in October of 2020, it was abundantly clear that if you have COVID recovery, then you are protected against reinfection and against severe disease. They couldn't abide by that, because if that's true, then you won't comply with the lockdown. If that's true, what if and this maybe was a legitimate worry, what if you go out and intentionally seek getting sick? They're worried about those kinds of things. Instead of worrying about things like this in order to control the behavior of people, they should have just acknowledged the basic scientific fact. Instead, they denied it and destroyed their credibility as a result.
Well, I mean, in the UK, what do you think about where we've gone from to this point, 15 million jabs free, now with children, and how people perceive it, and how have we got here, and what would you think is the most sensible thing to do about the situation?
So how did we get here? I think, as Jay said, the evidence certainly that I have looked at in a lot of detail, and I'm still looking at, suggests that the strongest benefit of the vaccine is in the elderly, in the people that are most risk. And so the question is, how do we go from there to vaccinating people who were low risk, knowing with the data as it evolved that it was not having any significant effect on transmission, even if there was some dubious or questionable data for that benefit earlier on, it certainly disappeared with Omicron. So what's going on there? And then it becomes a question of individual benefit and harm for that person, which again, I think that information is evolving, and I'm sure we will get there soon, and we'll have a better idea exactly what that benefit and risk is. So the question is then, what are the forces influencing that? And it could well be just a mistake. The WHO were recommending it. I I think an equally, if not more likely explanation, again, comes back to the corporate capture of medicine and public health. So, you know, the Pfizer, for example, have made $37 billion in profit from this vaccine. And if it had just been focused protection, they would have made a fraction of that amount, Alan. Okay? These are machines. These are entities that are there purely for profit at the expense of everything else, to the extent, and I've said this in lectures recently, I made this case, and it isn't just me saying it. So if you go back to the early 2000s, late 90s, there's a book and a documentary which was made by a law professor called Joel Bakan, and it's called The Corporation. And in that documentary, he interviews the forensic psychologist that was involved in the actual international definition of psychopath. And in that, he says that big corporations actually, in the way that they function as entities, not the individuals within them, it's not having a go at the CEO of AstraZeneca, by the way, knows where I live because I debated him in the Cambridge Union and he sent me a book afterwards, so got to be careful what I say, it's about the actual institution behaves like that. So I think that it's naive if we ignore the fact that they would have almost certainly played a role in influencing the decision-making of governments and maybe the WHO. And one final point in the WHO, I know there are many, many excellent scientists and good people in the WHO. I've been to Geneva. I was invited by Politico a few years ago, you know, to speak in a roundtable conference with members of the WHO senior committee on looking at tackling non-communicable diseases. But you know, he that does not remember history is bound to live through it again. 2003, the World Health Organization, with very strong evidence at that point, actually overturned or stopped making did not make a decision, which at that point would have meant that we would have had world advice across the globe to reduce sugar consumption massively because of the harms of excess sugar. And why did they stop in that deliberation or that decision-making process? Because when it was going on, the George Bush administration, the US administration, threatened to withdraw funding from the WHO if they were going to change their guidelines on sugar because they were lobbied by Coca-Cola. You can look this up. So they are not immune to influences from these, dare I say it, corporate psychopathic entities.
It's very funny because I was at Toronto Film Festival. I was at Toronto Film Festival the year they launched that, and I wrote an article about that particular documentary. And it did strike me that I hear what you're saying, but it's just a question for us all, right? Which is the question of how much we see ourselves within all of this. Because whether we're not going to necessarily win over everyone to the same idea. But it did strike me that the concept of that, a bit like the concept of anything big, is that it's out of our control and there's nothing we can do about it. And I think the question about what we can do about things, which is what was so inspiring about the Great Barrington Declaration and like putting an alternative that really got a lot of international recognition and put them on the defensive, and they had to try and smear, I think it was Devi Sudar who said, it sounds good in theory, but would not work in practice. Obviously, very balanced, objective Devi again in that quote. But the idea of what we can do about things, right? Even if there are big interests, and even if the political class has lost its way, but what's the role of citizens and professionals and all of that, and what we can do? And that's partly the inspiration for Together Declaration, which we nicked the second part of our name from copying you, just so out there in the Declaration. But that's a question for us all. And also I'm interested to hear what you all think about this, about how much we can all have an influence on some of the really tricky, thorny points that, you know, the speakers tonight have talked about, and to what extent, or is it all too daunting, or is the plan already all conceived and we all done, or can we have a way in shaping things like we did with the mandate, and we challenged it and got it knocked back, and with passports, even though we know digital ID has not gone away, right? And we know that the EU and the WHO has got a COVID pass with Deutsche Telekom. But what can we all do about things? So I'd like that to be part of some thoughts and reflections, but very much would like to hear from some of you now. We're going to take a round of questions or points. If you come and see Francis, he's got the mic, because so everyone on the live stream can hear you. Sheila, come down here and if anyone wants to speak, generally Francis is going to hold the mic in case, just because it makes it easier. But We know that Ahmed.
Can I take a quick go at your question?
Yes, just let you go. Yeah, absolutely. Just quickly, and then we'll come to the speaker.
You all will play an enormously important role. The public will play the central role in deciding what happens next, not scientists. We've failed, and you guys need to hold us accountable.
And one sentence I'll add in: if you want to know how we move this mountain, there's actually a great approach framework developed in Thailand called the triangle that moves the mountain, and there are 3 components to that. Okay, so it's the knowledge, making sure the evidence is correct and honest. Then it's translating that knowledge in a way that the public can understand to create the social movement. And then it's the politicians, because they have control over policies that ultimately are going to, make sure that people are protected from these manipulations. So that's the way that we do this. But to get there, then this is the hard part, is making this injustice visible, is to get this information into the mainstream. Because, to quote Noam Chomsky, the general population doesn't know what is happening, and they don't even know that they don't know.
Okay, if you want to say who you are, you can as well. I know who you are, but you can tell us all. Well, you don't have to, but we're amongst friends, so.
It's my name is Ahmed Malik, orthopedic consultant. I've treated lots of famous people, never been starstruck. Quite proud of that, but almost starstruck right now. You're clearly very generous people. You spent 2 years working hard, defending rights, and I'm really grateful to both of you and Alan. But I think you are being too generous. I think saying this is all accidental and incompetence, I find that difficult. It's too convenient. All the politicians marching lock, stock, same way, speaking the same language. It was all too much. The pandemic, the 202, meeting 202, the fact that the virus has already been patented, part of it. The design of this whole thing was more than just a coincidence. And I think we're just skirting around this. And Bill Gates and his influence, one of the biggest funders, if not the biggest funder of the WHO, I think he had a big role of changing the definition of the vaccine. The people who had the money to make the vaccine, who infiltrated all our politicians and cabinets, widely mentioned proudly by a very famous Klaus Schwab. I mean, I'm sorry, it's too much. And I think it's important because you said if we don't know about history, it will repeat itself. I think we need to look at the fact that a lot of our politicians, our media, our public health sector workers have been captured. And they're all working together. They're all funded by the same finance moguls, billionaires, oligarchs, media, healthcare, pharma, politicians, and they're screwing us over. And if we don't know that, it's going to carry on, and it still is, whether it's statins or childhood vaccines, or when you walk into a food shop and all of it is just shit. And now that you've told me about Bill Gates, I understand why he looks like he does. He's clearly eating the product he is invested in. But the fact is, you're being too generous. I really do. And I think we need to understand the nefarious element of what's happened in the last 2 years. Because like Bill Gates has said, if you're not scared of this pandemic, you better be for the next one. And what does he know? Because that's what I'm worried about.
Thank you. We'll take a couple. Sheila, come over to the mic, please. And if anyone else wants to come over, we'll do a couple, and then we're going to come back and we're going to keep coming out to you guys.
Thank you for all the work you've done in the past 2 years, doctors. I trained at University College London Hospital, and I just want to know, thank you for standing up for basic immunology, because the past 2 years we have seen the basic model of immunology totally buggered, excuse the language, but absolutely buggered. Can I hold it? So, just want to thank you for that. And also, I've got a point about when the hysteria was happening prior to lockdown, March 2020, I thought it was absolute madness that we were going to be locked in for an hour, and they didn't just sort of lock in, as it were, protect the elderly and the immunocompromised. Okay, that was a major thing going off in my head. And also, I want your opinion about, surely, if it was such a bad pathogen, why didn't they close the airports? Just want to know. They didn't even bother with travel, did they? You know? So.
Okay, so we'll take these two and then we can come back to the audience. So just on either of those or both or whatever, and we'll then start with you, Jay.
Let me start with the second one because it's more up my line. So I think that the closing the airports was too late, right? In April of 2020, I did a study in Santa Clara County, California, where we found that 3% of the population had already had antibodies to COVID. It did another study a week later in the second week of April of 2020, 4% of LA County already had COVID. The disease was already everywhere in January 2020. It was in Iran, it was in Italy, it was already everywhere. Closing the airports was too late because you close the airports when you have one place that has the disease and you don't want the disease to go from that one place to everywhere else. January 2020, it was all around the world. Basic immunology. I mean, thank you for asking that. I've been wondering that from the start of the epidemic. I think part of the problem is like our and this relates to the previous question. The people that were in charge of this, the scientists that are in charge of this, all of them, they got their expertise in the HIV epidemic. So many of the assumptions that were used in designing the policy were assumptions that were used in HIV to some success, honestly, right? So in HIV, if you're infected, there's no immunity to HIV if you're infected. If in HIV, you use contact tracing to try to identify a case and then slow the spread of it. That's actually quite effective. How do you control the spread of HIV? Well, you ask people to wear condoms. You know, you could master a little bit like condoms, I guess. I don't know. A lot of the intuition of the scientific leaders was built on HIV and inappropriately applied to COVID. In HIV, it's you know, there is actually a focus group of people that are at risk, but the idea of public health is to tell everyone, like, look, you could get HIV. You try to reduce you want to like make everyone feel like they're invested in the control of it. Well, they apply that same idea to COVID. Can I just really quickly address the question about the extent of planning and all that, and being too generous? I think we have to build a very broad coalition. So I don't think you start with the conclusion that there was a group of people that did this. I mean, if that's where the evidence leads, that's where the evidence leads. I think you start with understanding what the incentives are. I mean, I think Aseem's been very great at this. Like, what are the incentives of the pharmaceutical companies? What are the incentives of the politicians? I have a PhD in economics, so of course I'm going to think incentives matter. But I think understanding the incentives of different groups gets you very far. And sometimes it leads you to there's some small group, and sometimes it leads you to a much broader culpability. I very firmly believe there's a very broad culpability. And so what do you do in the context of broad culpability is honest assessment of what the incentives were and reform of structures. And I believe we can get there. It's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah, I think thank you, Ahmad, for your passion, and it touches the heart what you say, and I feel your anger. Believe me, I've felt your anger for a long, long time. And I think all of us, we have that within us, but ultimately, I think this has to be through dialogue and through, again, the default is I genuinely believe most human beings want to do the right thing. They want to have the right environment that they grow up, that they live in, they work in, for their kids. We hate injustice and we want truth, okay? The very, very powerful motivating factors behind how we live. And making that injustice visible and treating people with different views to us, and it's not easy, it's challenging, but I think it's more worthwhile to look at them with compassion. Actually, I think is going to have a much bigger, because we've got so much polarization right now, it's not getting us anywhere, it's going to be destructive. We have to be assertive, but we have to be compassionate as well.
Okay, we got some more here, thanks.
Hi, I'm Mira Forsten-Heft. I'm a veterinary surgeon and fellow of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. I've been against lockdown since day one, and I know about infection control and thought, what are they doing? And I've been trying to work out what we can do in the future. And one of the things that struck me listening to Matthias de Smet and about the mass formation, how people have been captured by the narrative.
Put it closer to your mouth,
Okay.
please. Thanks. Thank you.
Where people have been captured by the narrative and being extremely emotional rather than rational. And one of his views is actually that, are we moving towards a society that's more emotional rather than rational? And therefore, for the future, should we be using that? Because we all know if we use data, if we use ration, then actually we come all to the same conclusions. However, when I speak to people, and I've spoken to colleagues while this was happening, they were completely captured by the narrative. They didn't see where I was coming from, why I thought it was such a bad idea. So somehow, to get through to most of the population, we might need to use emotion more than we're using ration. So I was actually thinking a little bit further. So should we come up with our own pandemic plan where we actually, first of all, say, if you're ill, stay home. Secondly, work on your own immunity. That means, like the obesity side, eat well, exercise well, work on that. That would already take out a lot of these people that are at high risk for disease or severe disease. And then go to kind of, okay, what else can we do in a normal society to reduce death? And then at the same time, use ration a little bit down the bottom in terms of your face masks and your social distancing and locking up healthy people. And using the data, using the papers that are out there. But most of all, be emotional. I think that's where we're going wrong. That's my feeling. I've been trying to be rational for 2 years. And I think I've changed a couple of minds, but I don't think I've changed the majority of minds. So that's just my thought.
Okay, thank you.
Just got a question from someone who's a little bit shy, but very pertinent question. How concerned are you about the potential WHO pandemic and the impact on the sovereignty of each country and their health policies?
Okay, so let me take the first question about emotion. I think persuasion works by stories, and there are so many stories of people harmed by the policies we followed in the pandemic that have been suppressed, right? So just to give you some numbers, in Uganda, 4.5 million children are never going to return to school because schools were closed because of lockdowns. In March of 2021, the UN released a report that 230,000 children had died from starvation. Additional children had died of starvation in South Asia as a consequence of the economic dislocation caused by lockdown. Children dying of starvation. We have stories of small business owners losing their life's work because of lockdown, with no evidence that if you close your hairdressing salon that you're going to protect anyone from anything. We have millions of stories to tell about the harms from lockdowns, and all of those stories need to get heard. I think the mass formation idea. I think the idea is that I think the facts are quite important. Obviously, this in the career I've chosen, but I think the way that we convey those facts, if we show what the policies have actually meant, will be much more effective than just raw numbers themselves. And I think what happens is that so many authorities, all of them decided all at the same time that they're going to speak in the same voice, speak in the same direction. People, just like bodies have immune systems, I think public has an immune system. They can deal with some authority saying one thing, another authority saying another thing, and they can make decisions for themselves. But when every authority that you have speaks in the same direction, it's very difficult for the public. So we have to create structures that don't allow that to happen, that always allow independent voices, free speech, right? Something that's been suppressed during the pandemic. We have to allow those independent voices to have sway in, or else the body, public as a whole, is susceptible to the same thing happening again.
The heart rules the mind, says the cardiologist, right? I agree. We have to. These stories are very powerful. When we when I write articles, you talk about case studies in medicine. You can use case studies actually even to explain quite complex information, because we relate to that more. We are emotional beings. So no, I'm 100% agreement with you. I think using both. So, use reason to persuade, emotion to motivate.
And we talk about lockdowns, just to go back. I mean, the thing I never really understood is that I could go out and do a voluntary service for people who needed some food during a lockdown, and that was okay. And there were people delivering food, and that was okay. And so there was inconsistency in right the way through. And I suppose the question is, because it's the big one in the room about what is to be done, right? And the question about data and stories. It's certainly the case that it certainly strikes me that even now in the middle of a cost of living crisis that is going to it looks like it's going to get much worse, that is a direct consequence of shutting down society. I mean, things in Ukraine may have exacerbated things, but it's very clear that this is which they were warned about. About telling the stories and being as good as we can at making it really resonate. You've been really good on that on the international scale as well, talking about the consequences. But we've all got to get a lot better, because there was a big spend just in Britain, £500 million on a series of campaigns. And many people still are now concerned and scared. They're still scared. So we might joke about monkeypox and things like that. But actually, and a lot of people have really been jocular about it. But it's still the case that the impact psychologically has been intense, right, on people. And being able to tell stories and explain those things and get people to understand in new ways, that's going to be quite a challenge, do we not think?
Well, I think, it's actually, Alan, one way to think about this is, why did lockdowns fail? And I think the central problem is actually inequality, right? It's the lockdowns are a luxury of the rich. Who benefit from it is people who actually could afford to stay at home and stay safe. There's not that many. For much of the rest of society, they actually had to sacrifice. We had to sacrifice, right? I mean, I actually am one of the lucky ones. I have a job as a professor that I could do from home and not lose it. But so many people were either, even if they were older, required to go to work and get exposed. In the early days of the pandemic, so many. It's so unfair what happened during the lockdowns in terms of both who paid the cost. It was the poor, the working class, the children, and also who benefited from the lockdowns, right? As Aseem has pointed out. I mean, I think these kinds of stories about, if you connect it to why the policy didn't work, are powerful stories that will help us convince the public that this policy can't ever happen again, right? Because it tugs at the sympathy of everybody, right? I don't think there's anyone that wants children in South Asia to fail, to die as a consequence of malnutrition. I don't think there's anyone that wants adolescents, 40% increase in suicide attempts by adolescent girls in the United States, right? As a consequence of the mental health problems caused by lockdowns. These are things that no one in their right mind would say it was an okay thing to have happen. We have stories to tell. And if we can connect it to why the lockdowns failed, this is why they failed, because most people couldn't abide by them, right? We violated informed consent. We put in places these policies where if you didn't get vaccinated, you're unclean. Well, I mean, how does that connect with how we in society, in like civilized society, think about other people? Do we shame you for making a medical choice we don't agree with? Right? That, I mean, even if I've argued for the vaccine for older people, I think that was an absolutely terrible idea to create this idea that like other people are unclean simply because they didn't take a vaccine. I think those kinds of stories where we connect it to what our values really are, and I think all of us share those values, will help reverse the damage.
Do we have some more? Yeah, I can see some more people. Can another round of questions and points, please? Thanks. Speaking to the mic.
Can you hear me? Okay, yes. That's better. My name's Nigel Jacklin. I'm a statistician, and I'm married to the lady who asked the previous question about epidemiology. I have an answer to your question, what can we do, and then something else. We just need to be healthy, which isn't too difficult. And if we see that something's wrong, we need to get together with a bunch of other people and say we're not having this. And with NHS 100K and together, that kind of worked, didn't it? We weren't going to have it. I attended a Royal Statistical Society COVID-19 inquiry session about 2 hours ago. And in that, I explained that the overturning of conventional medical wisdom was bonkers in March, and that there was insufficient evidence to support it, and that the severity of COVID didn't justify it. I was surprised by the lack of a robust response to that. There was one bit, and really, if you then went forward to August, there clearly was no cause to perpetuate it. However, what I did observe was that all of the statisticians and medical people in the room had done their little bit, and their little bit was right as far as they were concerned, but none of them could see how all of those little bits added up and, excuse me, fucked our lives up. And I think that's the problem, that you've got all of these people who can see their little bit and can't see the bigger picture.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Johanna Ryan, and I try to do an awful lot of work to bring people together to understand how we can work together to combat this tyranny that we find building up around us. That's on a personal level. On a professional level, I work for an economic development charity that works in 28 countries around the world. And I'm triggered to stand up by something you said about Uganda. Another thing about children being out of school in Uganda is that the pregnancy rate amongst teenage girls has tripled in Uganda during this period. Also, the rate of child marriage has increased dramatically. And why? Because parents cannot afford to keep their baby girls, and they have to sell them off into marriage. This is a crisis for people who are the most vulnerable around the world. It is a livelihoods crisis. It is not a health crisis. And this is the thing that I and we need to get across, is that it is the most vulnerable amongst us who suffer. It is the people who are doing Deliveroo. It is the people who are manual laborers. And in my work, it's the subsistence farmers. It's the women looking after 13 children because they're looking after 13 children. And that is the message that we absolutely have to get across. And I think that the criminal thing, and I disagree with you, and I agree with you, I think that this has not been some kind of benign mistake and, oh shit, we've gone too far, now we've got to keep on going. No, I think that there was some degree of orchestration, though I don't know what that was. And now I talk to my colleagues in 28 countries around the world. They're all completely bought into, it's a health crisis, we have to protect one another. And for God's sake, you're in rural Ghana. What are you going to be afraid of? Starving or a disease that is going to kill you? You're afraid of starving. So, sorry, I'm not quite sure what point I'm making. It's just that this is a crisis of livelihoods, not of health.
Thank you.
Can I connect my answer to those two questions? I think they're connected. So first of all, thank you for highlighting the damage we've done to the poor around the world. That is incredibly important. The voices that were permitted at the table, who were they at the beginning? You had to have an epidemiology degree. You had to, otherwise you weren't allowed to speak. Or maybe a virologist and maybe immunologists, right? That's it. That's the only people at the table. And everyone else was excluded. Anyone have that experience? You're not an epidemiologist. Remember that? Epidemiologists, virologists, immunologists, they're all like fine people, but they do not have the depth of wisdom to order the world. And so it's what happened is those each person with their little tiny narrow expertise, they think that they understand the whole world, and as a result, they gave their advice, and they signed on. We have to prevent that from happening ever again. We have to allow your voice to come and say, look what's happening to the poor girls around the world. What's happening to children everywhere. What's happening what's happening to the working class. All that matters. All those voices were shut out during the pandemic.
I want to see if we let's take it. We've got a few people there, so because we're coming to the latter part of it. So anyone who wants to speak, come up and next to Francis. We'll take a few now, and then we'll see. We come back to you again, but just go for it, please. Thanks.
Hello, I'm in the arts, and I think my industry has been hit very badly.
Speaking to the mic, please.
You're still unable to work in major institutions without being vaccinated. You are removed from your contract and paid off and told to sign a confidentiality agreement. That's what's happened in 2.5 years. That's not my question. That's just a statement, and that is continuing. That's continuing. It's criminal, and it is criminal. Art, Royal Opera House, English National Opera, all of them follow this policy. It's a disgrace. And that's also happening in Europe and is happening around the world, in the West, actually, only in the West. Okay, I guess I'd like to talk about just a little bit about the question of removal of therapeutics from the shelves in 2019, before this kicked off. And you all know the therapeutics I'm talking about have now proved extremely effective. There was a vaccine passport roadmap published by the EU that I downloaded in PDF form in 2020 that they are following very nicely, thank you very much. The emergency use of the vaccine could only be implemented if there was no other therapies available. And that's what happened. And it's still happening. You still can't get these drugs in this country. What's happening? Where are the physicians? Why is the silence still here? It's a disgrace. I'm disgusted with the NHS. I want nothing to do with it. That's it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a few more and then we'll come back and then we'll have one last go. So I'm going to take a few of you and then come back out again. So go for it.
Okay. And Dr. Bhattacharya,
Excuse speaking to the mic, please.
Dr. Bhattacharya, when you say that nobody wants children in Southeast Asia to die, nobody here, no sane person across the world wants children to die. But there is somebody who set up a foundation that's original name was Bill and Melinda Gates Depopulation Foundation. And he has spoken for decades about the need to depopulate. And maybe he's okay with people dying because that's one way to depopulate. Why are we so scared to talk about this? I fear the fact that everyone's scared to talk about a potential depopulation agenda for which there's plenty of evidence. Let's debate it. Let's throw the evidence out if it's all nonsense. But a lot of people who've been promoting the lockdowns, the vaccines, all the dreadful mistakes in quotes that have resulted in death ultimately, but certainly a lot of pain for a lot of people, passionately believe in depopulation. So I think we need to stop being scared to talk about it. And just to mention, the reason that the vaccines are on the childhood agenda in the US is because it makes them the vaccine companies automatically immune from being sued. It has nothing to do with childhood health at all. And yet people say they're baffled about this. It's not baffling, it's kind of quite obvious, really.
Okay, thank you. Next one.
Hello,
Speaking to the mic, please.
I'm Johnny Blamey, and I've working as a teaching assistant in the secondary school. I just also got a background in philosophy of probability, so I've been very interested in the statistics of COVID and everything like this. I was a very great fan of the Great Barrington Declaration, but in January my father died having taken the 3 COVID shots and a flu shot. And it was just too much. And I had a neighbour he was 80, and I had a neighbour who had been planning his 80th birthday for 2 years, and then it got called off. And then he took the vaccines, and then he died. And so I just was wondering that all the people, almost everybody seems to say, oh, well, it's okay to do targeted protection of the elderly. And I'm thinking these elderly are used as this kind of vehicle for, oh, well, in that case, it's okay. And I've never really understood that, because as far as I'm concerned, and maybe I'm not an expert, but vaccines work by stimulating your immune system. The reason why elderly people are more vulnerable to diseases like flu is because they don't have a very good immune system. So giving them an experimental vaccine that only works if their immune system is working properly seems like a bad idea. And especially when the vaccine has these side effects that seem to show up in younger people, but probably are showing up in older people, but no one cares, because when my father died, he didn't get any medical attention, and written on his death certificate was frailty, cause of death frailty, which could, and nobody saw him basically for the last part of his life. So maybe it was a vaccine that caused him to die, and no one cares. And I've been looking at the Office of National Statistics, and now there's 1,000 more deaths in England and Wales per week than there was last year and the previous 5 years, and that is pretty consistent going back almost 6 months. So I was wondering whether this targeting the elderly, I don't know, maybe that's a weakness to say that, whereas the elderly are the ones who've been ruined the most.
Got it. Thanks. We're going to take two more. No.
From a medical point of view, I want to talk about this.
I know, Ahmed, you can't. We've got loads of people.
It's about
Sorry.
autopsies.
I get it. But we've got a load of people waiting. So, no, that's all right. If we have time at the end, we'll come back to you. These have got to be shorter now.
Yeah,
Sorry.
short and sweet.
Just there we go. We love that.
Yeah.
You, and then we're going to come back and then come back out again.
So my name's Martha Fisher. I'm a teacher, I'm a poet, I'm a spoken word artist, and I'm sick and tired of being asked, how do you feel to be unvaxxed? How does it make you feel, you selfish bitch? I've had people say this to me at work. My question is, how do we reclaim bodily autonomy in an age of mass compliance where we've gone centuries back into the dark ages, where mass compliance has rendered that whole concept a dirty concept? It's a dirty word. Bodily autonomy means I'm selfish, I don't want to compromise. So my question is, what do we do? I mean, I'm a fan of philosophy, I'm a fan of bioethics, but how do we go beyond, the kind of myopia of people today? Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Good question. One more, and then we'll come back on the mic. No.
Okay, sure. Just not like this. Okay. Well, firstly, thank you so much for tonight. It's been amazing. My name's Jenny, and I'm doing a research fellowship at the London School of Economics, essentially about the social movement and activism around this movement and how it intersects with political inequality and how political inequality intersects with other forms of inequality. So Jay, thank you so much for your insights in terms of how inequality has massively perpetuated the negative impacts of this pandemic, because it's really important that we keep being reminded of that. What I'm really interested in is the next steps in terms of how little democratic space there has been for political accountability, and how, as you mentioned, Jay, you're automatically fringe if you are asking questions about something that, when you have had so much of your rights taken away, why are you not asking questions about that? And why are these the only spaces where we have to reflect on things like this? And the biggest thing that we've went through, essentially. So basically my question is, sorry, I was meant to keep this short. My question is about, we're going into a massive cost of living crisis in the UK, which is massively going to negatively impact people's sense of their own political voice and the time and capacity that they're able to have to advocate for themselves in these situations. And you talked earlier, Aseem, about emotions is what motivates people, but I also think that there is a hierarchy of emotions, and sometimes emotions can delegitimize what you're saying. So I'm going to push you a wee bit further on that. What is it, do you think, that is going to motivate people? What is it, the emotion? What do you find that's effective, that gets people up from the sofa and YouTube videos and gets people active and annoyed, angry about this?
Great.
That's it, yeah.
Thank you. So take one each. or two at the most, because we got some more people. The thing that you's most pressing, and thank you.
Let me try to tie together the answer to a bunch of these the thoughts around this. I think there's an idea here about what was done to us, and what was done to us was a weaponization of empathy, a weaponization of empathy. My vaccine protects you. My mask protects you. Most of us want to be empathetic. We want to protect other people. That's built into our DNA as human beings, I believe. We don't know how to do it right, but that's what we want. And the rhetoric of the vaccine mandates, the rhetoric of masks, the rhetoric of staying home was all a weaponization of our natural impulse to be empathic to each other. We have to reverse that. We have to help people understand that that just staying away from other people is not empathic. Taking a vaccine that may protect me but has no effect on whether I can spread the disease is not empathic. It's not. It's in fact, empathy is much broader than that. And the political movement that we build, I think it ties together people from lots of different political points of view. It's a huge opportunity going forward. But we have to understand what was done, and then we have to work against it if we're going to do it right. I really firmly believe it has to start with empathy for ourselves, for people that we disagreed with. We have to. I think it starts with forgiveness, and then from there we can move to understand what happened, so we can build a movement so it doesn't happen again.
You want to come? Thank you. Aseem?
Yeah, I think in this room we have a very strong case and argument that I think if most people heard it, we could persuade them over to our way of thinking about being more open-minded and understanding all of the information to make decisions about everything we do in our lives. So how do we get there? Well, first of all, I would say that we've actually achieved a lot. Together have been amazing in this campaign already. I remember, I did everything I could, both in every opportunity I had on mainstream media and even behind the scenes to get stuff to Sajid Javid when we had legislation essentially being passed through Parliament, the House of Lords. I had NHS staff members contact me in tears. I said, hang in there to the very last minute. They will overturn this. And we overturned it. We overturned that NHS vaccine mandate. So we have to keep going with what, with our aims and our focus on all of these issues we've discussed today. But the hardest part, I think people need to understand that the biggest impact and influence of public opinion, rightly or wrongly, is still the mainstream media. So this movement has grown, and I think we're at a tipping point. I think people are realizing now that what's happened in the last 2 years hasn't been in their best interest. I think that we use this crisis as an opportunity. And I actually genuinely believe that things have shifted on the ground, and that bubble, this corporate tyrannical bubble, is close to bursting, and we have to keep that fight to make sure it happens. We cannot be complacent. We all have to continue to be courageous and be willing to speak up and back each other.
Thank you. Well, we're gonna take everyone in this round. It's going to be the last round. So anyone who wants to speak, please do.
All right, hello, my name is Rory Jacobs from Portsmouth. I'm 18. First of all, I want to say I'm actually on Jay Bhattacharya's and Aseem's page when it comes to the vaccine, which is quite controversial because there's this line between kind of being very pro-vaccine and being anti-vaccine, but there's also a balance of that. You can be pro-vaccine for elderly people, but also, not support young vaccination for COVID specifically. And I feel like that's why I have so much respect for Jay Bhattacharya and Aseem, because I do feel like there are certain people who have gone down a rabbit hole in this whole COVID thing. I really do think that. I know that might be a bit of a trigger for a lot of people. And I feel like these two have really kept their credibility in the way that they've been data focused. They haven't said that the vaccine for elderly people is dangerous. They've kept that. And I think that's important to say. But the question I have for Aseem specifically is, it's back to the GB News interview which you've done, which went completely viral. I've watched that probably like four times or something. like what's the current landscape for like heart attacks? Because that's what the whole interview was with GB News, and it blew up. So I'm just wondering, what are the current movements right now with the data to do with heart attacks, you know, cardiac arrest, and kids vaccination?
Great, thank you, All right, we'll come back to it. Yeah, just.
Hi, my name's Kavita. I don't have a medical background, but I'm curious. And my question is about groupthink in medicine. Before, when I was eligible to take the vaccine, I asked a doctor, and I was really dismissed about any concerns I might have. Just like I was told, you know, like if you saw what happens in A&E, you wouldn't even question it. You know, and I was asking because I was thinking maybe there could be an impact on, you know, menstrual issues, maybe not, but I just asked the question and was dismissed, even though there was some kind of initial data that suggested maybe some women were having some issues. Anyway, I didn't take it because I thought I don't need it. I got COVID and got better. But then I have a friend, I know that anecdotes don't make data, but, you know, she has been harmed by AstraZeneca. Seemed to have some kind of neurological problem, sees lots of doctors and specialists in the NHS, but is just sort of passed from pillar to post, dismissed. Some people have said, yeah, could be the vaccine, but they will refuse to write it down. And in the end, they've said, yeah, maybe you need to see a psychiatrist. Yeah, and she's actually lost her job. She's in pain all the time, has heart problems, neurological problems, lots of other things. And it's really disturbing because doctors, I mean, are supposed to be the ones that we go to for guidance, and actually it feels like, you know, it's hard to trust.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Peter Howe. I don't have a medical background either, but I just wanted to say something about the split I think there is between the people who think it's a cock-up and that it's a conspiracy. And I think what I noticed tonight is that people have fallen into two camps, really, and they seem to stay in those camps all the time. And I think that the reason for that is that there's a lot of truth in both. It's much more nuanced than just that idea. And I think I think there are certain things. Personally, I've never believed any of it from the off. But I think that what you were saying about the fact that there are vested interests and that they're very strong, and how people, you know, get attracted to what they've done and so on. There's a tremendous amount of that. But what I don't see is actually the debate about this has just gone bang. It's just gone into two sides again tonight. And I think that we have this idea that if there's a conspiracy, then everybody must be involved in it. And I don't think that's actually likely, and I think that doesn't mean also that there isn't something going on. And I think my example of that would be what happened in the Iraq War, when evidently there was a conspiracy because there were no weapons of mass destruction. But we had everybody, half the country believing in that cause, half our politicians. And if we believe Chilcot, which I do actually, even our prime minister wasn't actually lying. That's what he was saying. And the thing is that this idea that we've all got to be, everyone's got to be in on something, it doesn't mean that there isn't something that started this off. And I think, if I may take issue with both of you about what you said, is you've said a lot of times tonight, you've been puzzled. And those of us who actually have thought there's something's wrong from the off, we haven't been puzzled for 1 second. Not for 1 second.
Right. All right.
Sorry, just to say this. And the last thing I'd say is that you said that the reason for the frightening people was to get them to comply with the lockdown. But my memory of things is that the frightening started in November, December, before there was any mention of a lockdown coming in March. And that doesn't fit with the idea that it was to make people comply with the lockdown. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Yogi, and I'm a follower of Aseem and Jay, of course, and love your kind of commentaries and things. So you've done a great thing for all of us. However, I do disagree with a few things, of course, as people have already kind of said things. So Yogi from freedombumperstickers.com. So what I'm suggesting is that do people think that this is more of a marketing problem than it is, or an advertising problem and campaigning problem than it is a medical problem? Because the capture of the media, the capture of, all the papers and whatever else means we don't actually have the distribution means for getting the message across. So are we underutilizing aspects of other things like the car and whatever else, which could be used with colorful stickers like this? Oh, let me see if I can. Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, that's great. So there are no anti-vaxxers. There are only ex-vaxxers who did due diligence to find issues as with thalidomide and tobacco science. Let's stop putting vaccines on a pedestal, and some websites to direct people to as well.
Okay, thanks, Yogi. And then,
Good evening. My name is Edmund Sutton. I have a physics degree, but my professional work has been in theatre lighting, which of course was eviscerated 2 years ago. Thank you very much for all your work over the past 2 years. It is fairly clear to me, at least, that there have been criminal fraud perpetrated. For example, the granting of emergency contracts for the supply of protective equipment for medical staff and others, which is now being scrapped. And a famous case involved somebody in a fashion company being granted a contract by somebody connected with Boris Johnson. So it would appear that there is certainly a criminal case to be made in about certain aspects of this whole procedure that we've been undergoing for the past couple of years. Who is actually going to take that on? I ask the question. It would be very unlikely that a government who would prosecute itself for misbehavior like that. One of the things that has struck me over the past couple of years is the overweening pride. There's a good reason why it's one of the worst, the deadly sins. The overweening pride of, for example, Mr. Hancock, Professor Whitty, etc., Tony Fauci. We are right. Whatever we say is right. You're wrong. I thank you also for your humility that you acknowledge that there is other evidence available. So the question is, all of us in this room, we agree by and large, and we can talk about it, but we actually have to take some practical steps to prevent it from happening again. That might mean putting together some form of private criminal prosecutions. It might mean a political movement, for example, to allow the removal of candidates in an election. At my university, all elections had a vote for Ron, which stood for reopen nominations. And if you voted for that, it meant, I don't like any of these, I want to rerun the election. My MP is not replying to any letters anymore.
Okay.
I can't get rid of him anymore.
All right. Thank you very much. Francis has got the last question or point, and then we're going to come back to the panel.
Yeah, I'd just like to introduce a couple of points of fact on the idea of whether it's a conspiracy or not. We all understand that maybe not everybody in the world or every doctor and nurse is trying to conspire against us. But on the point of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they were at one point the biggest donors to the World Health Organization through subsidiaries like Gavi and so on, and the foundation itself. Dr. Fauci gives out billions, more than the Bill and Melinda, which was a surprise to me, more than the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to academia and research. So he controls that aspect of it. Also, when we're looking to speak out against these things, and we find that we're censored, the media's co-opted, and then you look at where Bill and Melinda Gates' money goes, it goes to the media, to the BBC. There's a YouTube CEO saying that you can't say anything against the World Health Organization on the media. So the tentacles are all there if they want to put us in a vice-like grip. And then it's just up to us to decide whether that is actually what is happening or not. And MHRA as well, they gave £1 million to them in 2018, I think it was. So the idea that the elephant in the room is not vaccines or anything like that, it's eugenics. And it's just a question of whether you can put those pieces together to see it. Now, there are other things to look at as well. Like Dr. Aseem said before that he had the humility to say, oh, I was mistaken at the beginning, I was disinfecting my shopping and so on. But we have to look at all our paradigms because all our education system has been co-opted, all our media has been co-opted. And if you start to look, there are 190 freedom of information requests from around the world that's on Fluoride-Free Peel, it's a website you can look at, that say that there's no purification of the virus has ever happened. Now, no people don't want to hear that. But also, if you just want to look at the Bill and Melinda Gates things, there's a very thorough article on the grey zone for people watching. They can look it up, and you'll be able to find it through your search engines. And it shows you the extent to which Bill and Melinda Gates' activities have caused problems throughout the world that are very, if they are not eugenics, they may as well be. Whether it's 490,000 paralyzed children in India through the oral polio vaccine. There's a number of things you can look at. And at this stage, from my point of view, and it's one opinion in the world, it's burying your head in the sand not to recognize these things.
Right. So you're not going to be able to deal with every single question and point. So what I'd like you to do is to deal with any that you want to from that, any particular, but then like in summation of where you think we are and going forward. And it's an impossible task to do in a couple of minutes. All right, but if you can do that, that would be really fantastic. So, and then we're going to carry on discussing afterwards, obviously informally, and continuing to debate and discuss and argue. But
let me thank you, Alan, for inviting me. The key word I want to get out of all of those fantastic questions, really interesting questions, is humility. Right, I have much to learn, and I think if we have that spirit going forward, we'll all do much better. I think, what do we do going forward? We have to come to terms with what's happened, right? It's too painful. Too much damage has been done. We've ostracized too many people, good people out of society. We have to heal in a fundamental way. And I think the key part of that healing is that we don't make the mistake that led us into this in the first place. One of the key mistakes we made which is that we decided that only a certain number of people should have a voice. Whatever healing happens, everyone needs to have a voice in it, and we cannot exclude people. Even if I agree or disagree with you, that's not a reason to exclude you from our conversation in understanding what happened. And I think we have to insist on an honest evaluation, no matter where it leads. It may lead to some people did criminal acts. It may lead to just a lot of mistakes. We have to have an honest conversation so that as many people as possible agree that whatever the result is, we've honestly assessed it and we've changed the structures that led to it. Let me just say one last bit about the science here. How scientists were led to be all on the same page. You mentioned Tony Fauci. This is just one angle on this. Tony Fauci controls $45 billion of funding for scientific research in the United States. But it's not just any funding. The National Institute of Health, so I'm a professor at Stanford University. It's very difficult to get tenure at a place like Stanford in a medical school unless you have NIH funding. When you have scientific leaders that are responsible for funding and the careers of countless scientists, also in charge of health policy, you have an inherent conflict of interest, right? So we have to peel apart, like Aseem's mentioned, many other conflicts of interest. We have to peel apart these conflicts of interest when we do this assessment. And when I say build structures, we have to create barriers so that those kinds of conflicts of interest cannot ever happen again. And we have to involve more voices. You guys are going to be the central part of this. Thank you.
So how do we fix this problem? Well, we fix it, all of us. It's not somebody else's problem, it's our problem, and therefore we have a duty to act and to speak courageously on it. And we must have faith and hope that ultimately the truth will out. And I think we're getting there, but we have to, again, keep fighting for it. In terms of a couple of people who suggested maybe I'm being a bit too mild, I'm always in conflict between sometimes trying to show compassion with people who have a differing view towards me, and also, showing some anger. But I think one of the things that I've mentioned in my lectures recently, and this is a way of reframing this discussion, it's not about conspiracy theories. I got asked this question a number of times when I was trying to lead inquiries into the drug industry over the years, when I was on BBC News or whatever. And I said, it's not about conspiracy, it's the way business is done. Okay? This is what's actually the root of many of these problems. So the new term I'd like to introduce is that we have the psychopathic drivers of health decisions, or the psychopathic determinants of health. Hopefully the people who think I'm being a bit too mild may like that. Okay, so I think we have to reframe it that way, and it can be backed up. And in terms of moving forward, I think we just have to keep making noise. Harvey Milk said, rights are only won by those that make their voices heard. And today, I'm inspired by you. There's so much passion and energy in this room. Don't underestimate the power of your speech and the power of the truth.
So I want to say Right. Just a few reflections on why we're doing these Together talks and what Together is about, and having, being inspired and have some humility with, two great panelists. But a few things to reflect on, right? The first thing is that the World Health Organization has just announced that they do think that, or they recognize that the Wuhan lab was a leak, right? So there's things like that come out, and then at one point presented as a kind of wacky thing, and the next thing you see out there. But the question strikes me, and together we've always been about this. So we have many people that have chosen to have a procedure or not have a procedure, but the question is about everyone having the right to choose, and that as a fundamental paramount right for all people in society with freedom. The question about being able to have these debates without being silenced and censored, right? Whether, to be able to have these in public, which you're not able to have. And also the question about how we go and win people that do not think, maybe as we all do in this room, that freedom's really important, whether we agree that there's something I actually think it's more terrifying that there is not a plan as it happens, because I think things can get much more chaotic and out of control, but that's my personal opinion. But the fact is, there's many people in society that we haven't won over. There are many people that throughout this whole thing haven't even associated that the cost of living crisis is a consequence of lockdowns. And I think that we've all got to get a lot better at going out and winning people and bringing them into the discussion and engaging hearts and minds and winning them over. And for that, we're going to need to be able to connect with people. And that often means not saying that people are stupid or shills or COVID idiots or gammons or whatever, but it's about this sense and spirit of winning over hearts and minds, communicating with our fellow citizens and winning. Because in the end, the battle of ideas is about the battle of numbers as well. And it's about how we're going to force ourselves to insist on the free space. And there's a number of things, as we know, that are happening right now. The COVID pass internationally with the World Health Organization and the EU. We've also got a digital ID pass that's happening in the UK. It's just not mandatory at the moment. But you mentioned Uganda. Uganda have got a central bank digital currency and digital ID. They're trying to get rid of cash at the moment, very interestingly. We've got the question of the policing bill at the moment, where you can ban people from going on protests under all sorts of criteria, right? And you can have to wear a tag if you go there. And we've got the online safety bill, right, which is perhaps the most draconian and worrying, which is that if we're not allowed to speak about these things and argue, because I really disagree with a lot of things that Francis says, but we can discuss them openly. If we get pulled down every time we have this discussion, then we can't fight for anything. We can't argue for anything. So it's incumbent on us to go out and win our friends and our neighbours and fellow citizens to get involved. Because right now, in the summer, post 2 years, many people think that's all done and it's gone away. Even though we've got perhaps an autumn and a winter that's going to be absolutely terrifying. So the question is what we're all going to do about it together. So it's in that spirit that we're doing the talks, and it's in that spirit that we're also trying to get more people to join us as members. I'd like to thank again very much Dr. J. Bhattacharya and Dr. Aseem Malhotra. Thank you.